This bizarre story was reported in the media in 2008 in many countries around the world. Theories were proposed, ranging from hypnosis and testing unprecedented drugs to the involvement of secret services with poison gas. But of course, the most significant connection was between the twins. This connection was called a karmic bond, which scientists allegedly still cannot identify or explain to the public. The story began on the morning of May 17, 2008. Traffic police officers from Birmingham, monitoring footage transmitted by traffic cameras to the monitors of London's streets, suddenly discovered two women walking on the median strip of the suburban highway M6. Police patrols were dispatched to the scene, one of which was followed by a film crew from the Daily Morning Show. At the site where the two women were walking in the middle of a busy highway, the police officers and journalists initially thought they were encountering a typical situation. The women would either turn out to be eccentric individuals or drunk or drug-addicted people who had lost their sense of time and place. This incident seemed to pose no particular risks, and it seemed to everyone that this story would soon be forgotten. Who would have thought at that moment that it would take a terrifying turn? As the vehicle with the police officers and journalists drove to the scene, a report came over the radio that one of the women had run into the road and been hit by a car. Nothing was yet known about the severity of the injuries. One of the participants in these events began to regain consciousness. The story became more complicated and already had unfortunate consequences. When the reporters arrived at the scene, they saw that the police officers, who had arrived a little earlier, were already talking to the women on the roadside. Both women seemed uninjured, and the report that one of them had been hit by a car appeared to be a mistake. It later turned out that the woman had indeed been hit by a car on the road, but had fortunately remained uninjured. The twin sisters looked completely normal. They were not staggering, not screaming, and only half-heartedly listened to the officers' warnings, occasionally glancing around. The journalist began filming the officers explaining the incident with the camera, and suddenly something happened that was hard to believe, even if seen with one's own eyes. One of the sisters, Ursula, threw her bag onto the sidewalk and ran into the road just as a large truck was passing by. The quick reaction of the officer, who tried to grab her by the sleeve of her jacket, was unsuccessful. The woman, clearly in a state of mental confusion, accelerated rapidly and simply threw herself down. She did not want to be saved. She desperately wanted to die by being crushed by a massive machine. So, she jumped directly under the wheels of the vehicle. The truck driver managed to react quickly but could not stop immediately. Ursula Eriksson's legs were struck by several wheels of the trailer, causing them to break on the spot. The woman screamed once like a wounded seagull and then lay motionless on the road. Stunned by what they had seen, everyone rushed to help her. At that moment, attention to her sister, Sabine Eriksson, who was lying on the roadside, lapsed for a second, and she immediately took advantage of it. She followed her sister and also ran into the road, where she was hit by a Volkswagen Polo within a second, thrown into the air like a doll. The reality of the incident was hard to grasp. 3 meters apart lay two women on the road, both having wished for death at such a young age. Despite their severe injuries, they were alive and conscious. Ursula Eriksson had open fractures in her pelvis and both legs, with bones tearing through her trousers. Sabine lay on her back, struck by the powerful blow of the car that had shattered the windshield and heavily damaged the roof. Both women said nothing and barely groaned in pain. As they began to recover a little, both tried to stand despite their injuries. They did not listen to pleas and orders to remain still until the ambulance arrived, but suddenly started cursing, spitting, scratching, and fighting against the officers as if they were their worst enemies. It seemed that this fight was their way of staying alive. There was no other way, and for some reason, they repeatedly called for the police, saying, "I recognize you. You are not a real policeman," even though several officers around them kept showing their badges. During this time, Ursula was also in an emotional state, constantly trying to hit the doctors and the arriving ambulance personnel. She bit their hands, spat in their faces, and screamed the foulest curses. To calm the patient, who needed immediate surgical help, she was given a strong dose of sedatives. Only after she calmed down was she airlifted by helicopter. At this point, everyone was convinced that the twin sisters Ursula and Sabine Eriksson had been poisoned with a hallucinogenic substance. Both women were airlifted to the nearest hospital. Ursula underwent surgery. Her spleen was ruptured. Her spine, pelvis, and both legs were broken in several places. Sabina, on the other hand, was not severely injured and was handed over to the police. At this point, about 5 hours had passed since the traffic accident. Sabina had noticeably calmed down and was cheerful. There was no trace of her violent behavior. She was no longer aggressive, responded to questions, but simply did not answer many, did not try to fight or escape. In a word, she behaved normally and appropriately. This is why the police officers who picked her up were initially very surprised. After being told what kind of person they would be dealing with, the officers expected to see a real devil, but a delicate, calm, blonde girl came out of the hospital in a hospital gown and obediently went to the police car. Therefore, Sabina was not handcuffed as she took a seat in the back. Upon arrival at the police station, she talked about the weather, laughed and joked, even flirted with the officers, and allowed herself to be examined and searched. Outwardly, it seemed that this could not be the same Sabine Eriksson who had been a raging fury just a few hours earlier, ready to tear apart anyone who touched her. Now, she behaved calmly and reasonably with other police officers, not those who had tried to calm her down on the road. Soon, everyone began to treat her as relaxed and rational. These officers did not see what Sabina had done on the road. They did not fend off her kicks, did not wipe her spit from their faces, did not see the car she had smashed with her body, did not hear her, and did not try to restrain her by force. It was all somewhere out there in reports for senior colleagues and on the screens of a morning show that these officers could not watch during their shift. They tried talking to her, but Sabina seemed, for some strange reason, to have forgotten everything that had happened to her. She did not ask about her sister's fate, or showed no interest in it, but constantly checked her reflection, worried about her appearance, and looked for her clothes and jewelry. She continued to joke, and when asked about her behavior, she either remained silent or said, "I don't know." She claimed she had never wanted to harm herself or anyone else in her life. Ultimately, the interrogation brought no clarity. Later, tests revealed that neither Eriksson's sister had taken drugs or alcohol. Nothing was found in Sabina's apartment, and the police found no evidence that the sisters had ever used or purchased illegal substances. Sabina was charged with assaulting police officers and causing an accident, while Ursula was obviously pitied and escaped responsibility for her actions. A call to her husband shocked the police. He had no idea where his wife was, what had happened to her, and most importantly, did not seem particularly interested in what crime she had committed. But the real surprise for the investigators dealing with the Eriksson sisters' case was yet to come. After speaking with Sabina on the day of the incident, police and psychiatrists concluded that the woman's mental state was normal, independent of her condition on the M6 motorway. She knew where she was, who was with her, could assess time and space appropriately, and most importantly, was stable and posed no danger to herself or others. It was hard to believe, but it was also only temporary. Now there was no reason to diagnose her or commit her to a psychiatric clinic. Therefore, Sabina was held in custody for a short time. On the morning of May 19, 2008, her trial took place. She was found guilty, pleaded guilty to assaulting a police officer and causing a traffic accident, and was sentenced to a fine and 1 day in jail, which she had already served in custody. Eriksson was released, having forgotten that just a few days earlier she had deliberately thrown herself under a car and in her rage had attacked police officers. Although no one ever understood what kind of temporary madness had befallen her on the road, everyone thought that this state was irrevocably over and she could go home. Later, this decision will be regretted by many people who will never understand what they did wrong. Sabina disappeared into obscurity. Her sister Ursula would undergo several surgeries and then spend about 3 months in a psychiatric clinic. Meanwhile, investigators Ursula would piece together what had preceded the incident on the motorway. It turned out that the twins, Sabina and Ursula, were born on November 3, 1967, in the Swedish city of Sundsvall. They were not the only children. The twins also had an older sister, Mona, and their brother, Bjorn. The twin sisters were in constant contact with each other and their families, but met for the first time in 8 years on the eve of the traffic accident on May 16, 2008. On that day, Ursula flew from the United States to Sabina in Mello and stayed with her. The next day, at 2 a.m., the mysterious sisters, driven by some inner urge, boarded a ferry to Liverpool, England. Once there, they purposefully sought out the police station. In no later interview or interrogation did the sisters ever explain why they left Ireland and went to England. According to the police report, they went to the Liverpool police station at 11:30 a.m. on May 16, 2008, to report that Sabina's children in Mello were in danger. The sisters' story was so incoherent and rambling that the police officers initially could not understand them. After listening to the women's hysterical accounts and not believing them, the officers tried to verify the truth of their statements. They called the Dublin police and found that the police had been called to Sabina Eriksson's house the previous night by neighbors who had heard screams and sounds of a violent family argument. It turned out that the couple had not only quarreled but had also seriously fought. The police tried to calm the couple down and warned them of the consequences. The argument seemed to have settled, and the police left, but no one knew what was going on in the house. After listening to their Dublin colleagues, the Liverpool police realized they were dealing with a desperate woman with marital problems at home. Intervening in such matters is costly, so the women were advised to calm down and return home to their children. When they left the police station, however, the Eriksson sisters did not go back home to Mello, but took a National Express bus to London at 11:30 a.m. Both carried rather large bags that were difficult to hold. The express bus driver immediately pointed out to the passengers that such luggage should be stowed in the bus's luggage compartment, but the women stubbornly refused to part with their bags. After initial grumbling, the driver let the sisters board the bus, but watched them in the rearview mirror throughout the journey, soon noticing their unusual behavior. The sisters appeared incredibly tense and constantly looked around. They whispered to each other and seemed to be planning something while clinging to their bags, as if they were their greatest treasure or their salvation from certain death. When they reached the next bus stop, the driver dropped the strange women off and reported them to the station supervisor. The supervisor immediately called the police and reported that 2 women were at the stop who might have a bomb in their bags. When the police arrived and searched the Eriksson sisters, they found nothing suspicious and considered the call a false alarm. Had they paid more attention to the twins' mental state at that time, they might have interrupted the series of terrible events that followed. But at that moment, their task was to prevent a possible terrorist attack, not to look into the minds of strangers. So, the sisters were released. As it turned out, for some reason, they had no money to get to London. It is unknown what was going through their minds at that time, but they likely saw the only way to reach the British capital by walking along the central strip of the M6 motorway, where they were seen on the monitors by traffic inspectors that day. You know the rest, but that is not the end of this fascinating story. Let's return to the released Sabina, who, according to psychiatrists, police officers, and judges, had returned to normalcy and no longer posed a danger to society. When she left the courthouse, she was told to go home to her husband and children, but she did not think of doing so. Instead, she wandered thoughtfully through the city, for some reason wearing her sister Ursula's green cardigan, which she had discarded before being run over by the truck, and carried her belongings given by the police in a bag. She walked into one of the city's parks, where she met 2 local men, 54-year-old Glenn Hollinshead and his friend Peter. They had just had a few glasses of spice beer in the bar and were now walking their dog, enjoying the springtime beauty with pleasant conversation. Sabina, feeling lonely and separated from her twin sister, or perhaps in a new state of madness, wanted to talk to someone. She approached the dog, petted it, said something kind, and then began a conversation with the men, word for word. She told them her sad story, that her twin sister had had a severe car accident and was now in the hospital, but she did not know which hospital, that she had no one here and no place to stay, and that her sister urgently needed to be found. Tears welled up in her eyes, and the men, moved by her distress, wanted to help her. Glenn, a former military doctor, was a sympathetic and open-hearted man and offered Sabina a place to stay for a few days. Moreover, he assured the unfortunate woman that he would help her find her sister. From that moment on, the kind man's fate was sealed. About 24 hours later, he would be brutally murdered by the woman he had offered his help to in his own home. The trio arrived at Glenn's house around 7 p.m. Initially, they only talked and drank beer. Sabina seemed very agitated, tense, and kept talking about her sister. She would sit down, jump up, rush to the window, and try to see something in the depths of the dark night. Then she would pull the curtains tightly shut, tremble, and be desperately afraid of something without giving any explanation. Soon, her behavior became strange. She refused to eat or drink, offered the men her cigarettes, and then snatched them out of their mouths, claiming they might be poisoned. Shortly before midnight, Peter grew tired of the strange spectacle, said goodbye, and left. What happened between Glenn and Sabina afterward is known only to Sabina herself. It is only known that Mr. Collins called his brother Paul, who worked at the University Hospital of North Staffordshire, around noon the next day and told him about the woman and her sister. He asked for help in obtaining information about Ursula's whereabouts, but realized it would not be easy. Then there is another dark spot in the story where no one knows what happened. On May 20th at 2:45 p.m., Glenn came out of his house and saw his neighbor Frank, who was washing his car in a cul-de-sac. He asked him for a few tea bags, got what he wanted, and went home. But just a minute later, he reappeared on the street, already bleeding. The only thing he could say was, "She stabbed me with a knife," and he fell dead on the cobblestones. According to police records, the ambulance arrived at the scene around 8 p.m., but as they approached the victim's house, the paramedics saw a true fury on the road, or rather on the safety island, a woman hitting herself on the head with a hammer. It later turned out that this woman was Sabina Eriksson. Just a few minutes earlier, she had stabbed Glenn multiple times in the kitchen and now stood completely deranged on the road, injuring herself and threatening other people. Some of the paramedics rushed to check if the injured man was still alive, while two ran towards Sabina. At the same time, one of the passing drivers, Joshua Grittick, braked in front of her, jumped out of his car and tried to take the hammer away from the madwoman. But Sabina once again showed incredible skill and strength. She dodged, pulled a stone from her pocket, and struck her would-be rescuer, causing him to fall to the ground. Seeing this absurd and terrifying turn of events, the paramedics immediately realized they were dealing with a dangerous patient who had to be neutralized and isolated at any cost. Although it is not usually the task of medical personnel to chase the insane, they rushed at Sabina to pin her down. But like a raging beast, she twisted with incredible speed and sprinted straight down the highway, scaring drivers with her swinging hammer. The chase lasted several minutes. It soon became clear that the woman was heading towards a multi-story motorway junction about 12 meters above the road. With a single leap, she climbed the bridge railing and, without a moment's hesitation, plunged into the depths. Thus ended one of the most bizarre and mysterious chases ever experienced in Britain. Sabina Eriksson survived, and her inexplicable episodes of madness probably gave her the strength of a movie superhero. What would have ended in death for most people ended for Sabina with only broken legs and head injuries in a hospital ward. She began behaving entirely normally again. Her aggression, delusions, and paranoia were gone. Either she genuinely remembered nothing of her actions or hid it masterfully. In any case, she told no one about it afterward. On June 6, 2008, she was brought in a wheelchair to her first court hearing. The prosecution had a long list of charges against the defendant and a complete lack of explanations and motives. Sabina's defense attorney fared no better. He had absolutely no idea how to explain his client's actions. Both sides quickly agreed that despite the psychiatrist's assessment that the defendant was currently sane, it was evident that both women were not themselves at the time of the crimes. How else could one explain what they did within a few days? Both the coroner and the leading psychiatrist in the country, Nigel Eastman, who participated in the trial, agreed with the defense. He described Sabina Erikson's state at the time of the murder as an induced delusional disorder manifesting as mass psychosis, and said that she was now completely healthy at the time of the trial. The defense psychiatrist said that Sabina had clearly suffered from acute palimpsestic psychotic disorder in moments of madness, also caused by mass psychosis. In the fall of 2009, a British court charged Sabina Erikson with several crimes, including the manslaughter of Glenn Hollinshead. She pleaded guilty but argued that she could not remember anything, had no malicious intent, and did everything in a state of confusion. Judge Justin Sanders described Sabina Erikson's case as the most challenging in his career and stated that her guilt in the crimes was very low as she was unaware of her actions. He also added, "I understand that the family of the deceased victim will not be satisfied with my verdict. Nonetheless, I render the judgment based on the fact that the cause of the murder was a temporary insanity, and therefore the defendant's guilt is minor. The punishment aims not to penalize the defendant and does not reflect the suffering endured by Mr. Hollinshead's family." The cause of all the actions of the two twin sisters was attributed to mass psychosis, known by different names in various languages. Sabina Erikson was thus sentenced to only 5 years in prison because the first crazy one was her sister Ursula, who infected Sabina with madness, and the virus of madness caused the woman to start hearing non-existent voices dictating strange actions. She suffered from delusional beliefs that she held as true. The case of the twin sisters Sabina and Ursula Erikson is a case where the defendants could do nothing to prevent severe consequences. In September 2009, Sabina was sent to an ordinary women's prison, where she served only 439 days, less than a year and a half, and was then released on amnesty. Throughout her time behind bars, no one ever noticed any signs of mental illness in her. It was as if Sabina and Ursula had once succumbed to madness in May 2008 and then never thought about it again. One sister returned to live and work in the United States, while the other continued to live with her husband and children in Ireland. Neither sister has ever answered questions about what happened to them in May 2008. Some people still believe that the criminal justice system failed in the Erikson sisters' case because it did not answer many questions or hold those responsible accountable. However, most people still tend to absolve the women themselves. Their actions are compared to the syndrome of a rabid dog. A sick animal is supposedly not responsible for its illness, but someone should have kept an eye on it and prevented it from biting innocent people. So said the brother of the murdered Glenn Hollinshead. "Harry, I question the criminal justice system for allowing Sabina Erikson to remain free and commit a severe crime. Her mental state should have been recognized in time, and she should have been isolated." But psychiatrists throw up their hands at his words. Without any diagnostic systems, they cannot identify such a state at first glance. Interestingly, the Erikson sisters' elder brother, Bjorn, disagrees with the court's verdict, though for a different reason than the deceased victim's brother. In his opinion, Ursula and Sabina did not fall into a state of temporary insanity in May 2008, but were indeed fleeing from a real danger. He claims the women were running from a certain mad stalker who had threatened them, so they preferred to die and threw themselves under a car. To this day, the story of the strange madness of the twin sisters Ursula and Sabina Erikson remains a great mystery.